You do not become a dissident just because you decide one day to take up this most unusual career. You are thrown into it by your personal sense of responsibility, combined with a complex set of external circumstances. You are cast out of the existing structures and placed in a position of conflict with them. It begins as an attempt to do your work well, and ends up with you being branded as an enemy of society. That was said by Václav Havel. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Surviving the Matrix. My name is Maxwell Igan. I will be your host for the next hour. Now, another quote that comes to mind to me today is a quote by Franklin Roosevelt. And Roosevelt said, "The only sure bulwark of continuing liberty is a government strong enough to protect the interests of the people, and people strong enough and well informed enough to maintain its sovereign control over the government." And I think that's a very, very relevant quote, and it's extremely important for people to understand the significance of that at the current time of peril which we all live in. And the peril that we face does not come from any group of terrorists. The peril comes from the actions of our governments. Our governments are doing some extraordinary things, folks. I must also announce to you with somewhat a sense of urgency that the Criminal Food Safety Bill, I am of course referring to Bill HR 2749, has actually made it through the House. It was facing enormous opposition, so the government actually changed the rules of Parliament to allow the bill to go through. It is now on the floor awaiting a vote by senators. So you need to write to your senators and get them to vote against this bill. If the bill does come through, it is your duty as citizens of the world to ignore the bill and to attempt action to remove from power the criminals who sought to instigate and legislate this bill, because this bill is an infringement of basic human rights and it must not be allowed to go forth. Even if it does go forth, it must be repealed, and it's up to the people to make sure this happens. Now, if you don't know what this bill is, Bill HR 2749, it's a very, very unusual bill. There has been a number of food safety bills that they've tried to introduce lately. Bill HR 875 was one of them. But a lot of these bills have been around for a while. They've been sort of trying to get them passed. But this one has sort of just appeared recently. I've seen it described as a mutant conglomeration of the worst of all the other bills, with one very original addition to all the other bills, and that is the addition of martial law. Now, you've got to understand that this bill also incorporates Codex into it, Codex Alimentarius. Codex Alimentarius was, of course, designed by the Nazi pharmaceutical companies that funded Hitler and provided the gas for the gas chambers. It was the brainchild of a man called Fritz de Meer, who was actually jailed in the Nuremberg trials. I'm sure I've spoken to you about this before. So this is also incorporated into this bill. It gives, as I said a couple of shows ago, it gives the FDA the power to quarantine any geographical area, which includes prohibiting or restricting the movement of food or of any vehicle that's been used to transport or hold any food within that geographical area. So this is the way they can control transport, right? This is all cars that have ever brought groceries, right? This is everybody. So they can shut down farmers markets, as I said, even though they're not the source of any contamination. They can basically shut down any geographical area using food safety as a way to do it, okay? Now, the first Patriot Act that was passed on the United States was a blatantly Hitlerian piece of legislation, but it was passed using the fear of terrorism. This bill is a Patriot Act itself, but it's a lot more, well, it's a lot sneakier because it's hiding under a cloak of food safety. But it's also using fear. It's using fear of food contamination. So, you know, Americans are kept so frightened that the fear of the slightest possibility of a terrorist or the slightest possibility of any of their food being contaminated will be enough to cause a lot of people to willingly trade all their hard-fought freedoms away for the promise of a little bit of safety, which is all it is. It's just the promise, because, I mean, terrorism and contamination are these two things that are just being used to completely end the US Constitution. And this is exactly what's being done with this bill. Okay? And it seems that Monsanto, dear old Monsanto, the criminal food company that wants to control all seeds, the wonderful people who brought us all this genetically modified food, who are also the makers of Agent Orange that Vietnam is still suffering from. I mean, Monsanto, folks, these guys are some of the biggest criminals on the planet. That's who's putting forth this bill. Okay? Now, folks, under this legislation, we see a loss of reality. We see a redefining of the term reality. Because the redefining of reality is what is underlying all the loss of freedoms that we're experiencing. Normal and free is disappearing. The concept of normal and free is disappearing into the corporate definition of what reality is. So we begin with contaminated food that comes from filthy corporate processes and concentrated animal feeding operations that ends up doing all these terrible things to our food. And what do we end up with after that reality is ground up by corporate legal hands? We end up in changes in the definition of the word risk, so that natural things are now treated as dangerous and toxic things are left alone and left untouched and seen as safe. So we have legislation that sees that healthy, normal farms are taken over by governments as though they are run by criminals. And we see that on the other side of the coin, contaminated corporate slaughterhouses are left untouched and left alone to carry on with just what they're doing. The necessary freedom of individuals to live and to grow food and to be left alone is somehow suddenly destroyed, even though they were never the source of any food contamination. And we see that profit and control and power of corporations, which were absolutely the source of all the increasingly terrible food and of all the poisons and all the environmental damage, we see that power to these corporations and profit to these corporations is vastly increased under this legislation. Now, thanks to this corporate control over reality and this corporate control over our governments, our wanting to clean up corporate processes and feedlots and end up with farmers markets and local organic food has become the industrialization and potential destruction of every single healthy part of the food system and the triumph of the most contaminated and toxic part. And this is being done by this type of corrupt legislation being passed through governments by insane lunatics who serve corporations. And it's happening because we are sitting back and allowing it to happen. Wake up, people, and do something to fix the problem. We wanted to clean things up. We wanted to clean things up. And thanks to corporate control over reality, not only did we not clean things up, we lost all of the healthy food on the planet. We lost the possibility of us ever having any healthy food. And into the non-bargain, we lost all of our freedoms and they took complete control over everything. You just got to go and have a look at Bill HR 2749 and just have a look at how insane and how distant this thing is from any reality that any people ever wanted. You know, we wanted good food. We wanted good food. We never wanted to trap our farmers into an industrial prison on their own land, afraid moment by moment of not fulfilling some monstrous set of instructions that will never end. Rules that don't do anything, that have nothing to do with any real farming. You know, we end up with Bill HR 2749, which is an intense corporate nightmare around the most central and necessary aspects of a free country and of free human beings: farming and food. We end up with farming and food controlled by insane, megalomaniacal, pharmaceutical lunatics. HR 2749 is the most vicious and most insane bill that a person could ever imagine. Who treats farmers in this way?